Welcome back, everybody, to Unit 1, Day 4. Today, we're going to continue talking about supply and demand, this time looking at what happens to price and quantity, what happens to equilibrium when there is a shift in either demand or supply, or if there's a shift in both demand and supply. And we'll talk about how to approach a problem like that. So let's take an example. Let's assume for purposes of today that tea and coffee are substitutes and that the price of tea increases. So we can ask ourselves, what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity for coffee? And we remind ourselves that when they are substitutes, I either consume one or the other. So in this case, price of tea increases, which is going to lead me to want less tea than before. I still want hot drinks. It's just that I don't want tea, which means I'm going to want more coffee. I will see, in this case, an increase in the demand for coffee. So graphically, it would look like this. I'm at equilibrium with a price P1 and a quantity Q1. And now my demand for coffee is going to increase or shifts to the right. And when it does that, it creates a shortage or a shortage at the original price. If the price remained at P1, the quantity demanded will be greater than the quantity supplied. That's not good. Lots of people standing outside wanting coffee and no coffee to give them. If I'm an enterprising supplier, and I am, I will increase the price of the good. It'll weed some people out of line. It'll give me an incentive to produce a greater quantity supplied. As the price rises, the shortage shrinks until I eventually reach a point at which the price and quantity is established where supply and demand are equal. The quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And what I see here is an increase in the price and an increase in quantity. So when we're talking about what happens to price and quantity, I say an increase in both price and quantity as a result of an increase in the demand curve in this example that I gave. If demand were to shift to the left, well then, so the opposite happens. If the demand shifted to the left, now what I have is a surplus of goods. If the price remains at P1, the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. That's not good. I got to get rid of my stuff. And so the price will begin to fall until I reach a point where we are equilibrium at P2, Q2, because that's the place at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded in the market. We can look at changes in supply. Let's pretend that cotton is an input in the production of blue jeans, which it is. And let's pretend that the price of cotton, an input, increases. So what's going to happen to equilibrium price and quantity for jeans? Well, if there's a change in the input cost, that's going to affect supply. So if the cost of cotton rises, it means I can't make as many pairs of jeans, all else being equal, as before, because I simply can't afford as much inputs as before. So the supply curve will shift left. And when the supply curve shifts to the left, we have a shortage. That is, the quantity demanded will be greater than the quantity supplied. Again, a problem. Price will rise until we get to an equilibrium point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded at a place at which price is P2 and quantity is Q1. We'll see an increase in the price, but a decrease in the quantity. Now, here's where I would stop and say it's very important, as I mentioned in a previous lesson, it's very important that we use the words left and right or increase and decrease to describe shifts in both supply and demand. And the reason why is because oftentimes people will say that supply goes up or down. If I said supply goes down, that's a left shift, but it confuses people because it appears the supply curve is actually above the original. The S2 is higher than S1, but it's not really more, it's less. So we don't want to say it goes up because S2 is up relative to 1, but it doesn't mean that I increase supply, it means I decrease supply. So sort of the visual is the most important here. We want to make sure we use the right words. Increase or decrease supply, or left for less and right for more. Really, really fight the urge to say up or down. Maybe price and quantity we can say up or down, but the supply curve, it's either going left or right. Same with demand. If we do the opposite case, let's say the cost of cotton drops, then the supply curve will increase. In this case, I can make more jeans than before because I can afford more cotton than before, all else being equal. And so we see a right shift in the supply curve. That creates a surplus of jeans. The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. That's going to lead to a reduction in the price and an increase in the quantity at our new equilibrium point, the new place at which the supply curve and demand curve intersect. Um, and so when there's a single shift, it's relatively easy. Best thing to do, draw a graph, make your supply and demand curves, look at the change, plot that change on your graph, and while you are not required to use arrows like I have here, it is helpful to use the arrows for two reasons. One, because it makes it super easy for the AP readers to know what it is that you are trying to demonstrate in your graph. They're working really fast, they've got lots of things to read, so the easier you make it for them to see what you're doing, the better. But secondarily, and maybe more importantly, it makes it very easy for you to say with certainty what's happened to price and quantity. When you draw those arrows from the original price to the new price, you can see very clearly price is dropping because the arrow is going down, and that quantity is increasing because the arrow is going to the right. So many times students sort of struggle with telling me what happens to price and quantity given a change in the market, but when they draw it and they use those arrows, it makes it very, very simple, not only for you to see what's happening, but to communicate what is happening in the market. Now, it's all well and good when only supply and demand shift. What happens when they shift at the same time? That's what we call simultaneous shifts. And the short answer is that chaos ensues, all right? We will be able to say with certainty what happens to either price or quantity, but we will not be able to say with certainty what happens to both price and quantity. One will be determined, one will be indeterminate. So let me show you sort of how to approach it. Let's take an assumption. Let's assume that the taste for SUVs, the preference for large vehicles increases. We decide as a culture that we want Suburbans instead of smart cars. And let's assume that the price of steel is decreasing. It's cheaper to buy the inputs that go into the making of these different vehicles. What will happen to price and quantity in the market for SUVs? Well, the way to do this is to draw two different graphs, one that looks at the demand change, one that looks at the supply change. And let's try and identify what is always happening regardless of the shift in supply or demand, and which is sort of dependent upon the change in supply or demand. So we can say that a decrease in the price of steel would lead to an increase in the supply of SUVs, and as a result, we would see the price of SUVs drop and the quantity of SUVs sold to increase. We can also isolate the change in demand. We can say that the increase in preference for larger, heavier vehicles causes the demand for SUVs to increase or shift to the right. That result of that shift is that the price and quantity of SUVs will both increase. And so we can say with certainty, regardless of whether it's a supply shift or a demand shift, in both cases, the quantity of SUVs sold goes up. The price, on the other hand, it just depends. Which is the stronger influence? If there's a huge increase in supply and a relatively small increase in demand, we'll see prices drop. But if there's a huge increase in demand and a relatively small increase in supply, we would see prices rise. So prices are indeterminate or ambiguous. I don't know. But I know for certain that quantity is always going up. And so when you draw these graphs side by side and you draw the arrows out and you put down price either goes up or down, quantity goes either up or down for the supply shift, and you do the same thing for the demand shift, you're just looking to see which of those two, either price or quantity, has a change going in the same direction. That's the one we know for certain. The other is a big question mark. Now let's take a shot at it yourself. Let's assume that the market for hot dogs and hamburgers are substitutes, that hot dogs and hamburgers are consumed one or the other. You don't have both at a barbecue. You either have a choice, one or the other, and that the price of hot dogs increases, that hot dogs are more expensive than before. And we'll assume that millions of ranchers have stopped raising their cattle. So the question is, what will happen to the equilibrium price and quantity of hamburgers with these simultaneous shifts? So take a second to graph out your answer, press pause first, then graph it out. And when you're ready and you think you know what's going to happen to price and quantity, then go ahead and press play, and we'll see how well you did. If you graph this out, then first thing we know is that if there are fewer head of cattle being raised, there are fewer cows, and fewer cows equals less hamburger. And so what we would see then is a left shift in the supply of hamburger, causing there to be an increase in price and a decrease in quantity. At the same time, hot dogs being more expensive means then that I will be eating less of them, but I still want to eat. So if I'm having fewer hot dogs, it means that I will be substituting into and experience a greater demand for hamburgers. So we'll see the demand for hamburgers shift to the right. And when it does that, it will lead to an increase in price and an increase in quantity. So when I'm looking here and I say there's a supply curve and a demand curve shift, what always happens? And I look and see that price always goes up no matter what. But the change in quantity is indeterminate. It just depends on which effect is greater. If there's a huge decrease in cattle relative to the increase in demand for hamburgers, we'll see the number of hamburgers decrease. If there's a huge increase in the demand for hamburgers and a small increase in supply, then we'll see an overall increase in the number of hamburgers in the market. We will continue our conversation about basic competitive markets and supply and demand next time.